So now let's talk about finding those elements. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're going to spend a lot of time on element selection. We've got an entire module coming up on element selection. For right now, we're just going to take a look at the basics. And those three basics are finding all items of a particular type, of a class, we'll have to talk about what a class is, and then finally, based on an ID. But let's start off by talking about an element. So an element, sort of as you might guess, is going to apply to the element. And so all we have to do inside of our CSS is simply say whatever the name of that element happens to be. And one very cool thing that you can do in the syntax, and I don't have it on the slide, is you can also actually list multiple elements with commas. So I could say, well, if I want that to apply to all H1 and all H2 tags, then I can just simply H1, comma, H2, comma, H3, and whatever else it is that, that you might want. So all of our H2 elements in this case would then have three different properties set on them. So our font family, our font weight, and our color. Now, I mentioned earlier, we're not going to go through every single property, because not only would that take forever, I think that would be a little bit boring.
Yeah, I think a lot of these are self-explanatory just from looking at it.
Yeah, generally speaking, they are self-explanatory. Now, you know, one of the things though, and I find this sometimes with like font weight and then font decoration, is it's not always as clear as you might hope. Yeah. This is where the IntelliSense in Visual Studio really shines.
Yeah.
That the IntelliSense for CSS is spectacular. So that way, if you're not sure of what you're looking for, just start typing a few characters. Chances are, just like Helen said, because a lot of them are self-explanatory, you'll find the one that you're looking for. So just type a few characters and then go, oh, okay, that's the one that I want, and then let the IntelliSense sort of guide you from there.
Exactly. I think the one that is confusing, though, is color. Color is one of the ones that we have here for the H2 element. Mm-hmm. And color, you might think color should just apply to whatever the element is. You know, if it's like a box, that would apply to the box. But it usually just applies to text.
Exactly. Yep.
And that's the one that I think gets a lot of people in the beginning.
Yeah. So you would think it might be font dash color.
Yeah, exactly. But it's color. If you put the color thing, the color property on body, that'll just apply to all the text in the body. Right. It won't make change the background color, for instance.
Exactly. But there is a background color property.
Exactly. Which we'll get to.
Yep, exactly, exactly. I also want to highlight real quickly here on this and kind of use this as a little side teaching, is you'll notice that we've got font family. And one of the cool things that you can do with CSS, and this is a little bit advanced and we're not going to dig too far into it, is you can actually push down your own fonts. So if you have a TrueType font and you want to push that down, you actually have that ability. So fonts are obviously a very big thing. There are a couple little catches about trying to push down your own font and things like that. So whenever you are going to be choosing a font, you want to give the browser the ability to fall back to something else. So if it doesn't have a particular font that you might want, give it something that it can fall back to. And that's exactly what font family is going to do here. Is that with font family, what I'm going to do is specify, okay, well, we want to use Verdana. If you don't have Verdana, then let's fall back to some other sans serif font, which is basically going to be just like that. So it's not going to have, so for example, if I had an L, so that would be a serif, so it's got my little feet. Sans serif is just going to have the little L. Yeah. Sort of the simplest way, I think, to describe it. Yeah,
I think serif fonts you can associate with like newspapers or basically print things, and then sans serif is what you normally see sans serif fonts online. They're a bit easier to read on the screens.
Yeah, they're a little bit easier digital-wise. Yep. Okay. So, element, that's going to apply to every single H2. Now, when it comes to like an H2 tag, that's probably just fine. Because you're probably going to be using those for headers, and you probably want all of your headers to look the same. So H2, just globally say, yes, we want that to work for everything. That's going to be perfect. But how about a div tag? Do you think that you're going to globally be wanting to set things for all div tags or all span tags everywhere?
Yeah, it's a bit too general, right? Because you're going to use those everywhere on your page.
Exactly. So we want to be able to, rather than just simply saying I want all div tags to look a particular way, we want to be able to identify particular types of div tags, because it's going to be based on how we're currently using them. So we might be setting up a navigation section with a div tag. So I might say div, but I want this for my navigation. Or we might be setting up a sidebar, and I'm going to be using a div tag for that. So we want to be able to identify different types of div tag. And that's where class comes into play. That a class is going to give us the ability to identify elements of a particular type, and the way that we're going to identify that type is by adding on a class. So there's going to be two moving parts here. The first moving part is going to be inside of CSS. Now you're going to notice here on the syntax that our syntax is slightly different from what we had before. That previously we just simply said name of the tag. Now what you're going to notice is I've got a little dot there. And my dot indicates that this is going to be a class. So that needs to be inside the CSS. By the way, you are going to notice that a lot of the demos are going to just simply use color, especially early on, just because it's such an easy way to identify when you're trying to do element selectors that, hey, look, this applied, or in the case of inheritance, that this is the one that actually won out. So we'll do a lot with color with some of the early demos. But in any event, so we'll make that red. So that's the first part inside of CSS. The second part is going to be inside of the HTML, and you'll notice right there that we've got class equals title. Now the great advantage to a class here is that classes are reusable. So it's possible that maybe this title is going to be for different sidebars. So I've got a sidebar here, I've got a sidebar over here, I want a title up top, I want a title up top. So I can go in and reuse that in multiple places. And I can flag, hey, this is going to be a title. Let me go erase all of my ink. There we go, perfect. So we've got our CSS, we've got our HTML, and thus the result is going to be hello CSS. Now, the problem with doing something like this is that that might be even still a little bit too vague. That maybe I'm going to be using title in a couple of other places. Well, fortunately, I can say I only want a class to work on a particular tag type. And the way that we do that is just by putting in that little tag name right at the very beginning. So now you're going to notice that I've got div.title. So that's only going to apply to div tags. So inside my HTML example, you'll notice that I've got a span tag here, and I've got a div tag here. So the result, when this is all printed out, is you'll notice that that will apply to my div, but it's not going to apply to my span. So my span is going to be whatever the default color is, but my div tag will actually have our hello div. And that is one of the little annoying parts sometimes about CSS, is if something isn't working the way that you expect it to work, generally speaking, it just doesn't do anything. Or sometimes it'll move something somewhere else, but it doesn't give you an error message. And this sort of goes back to old days, that one of the things the browser is going to try and do is look at what you've given it and try to make a best effort and not give you an error message if it isn't able to figure out exactly what you want. So it's just going to try and give you the best that it possibly can. We will notice a little bit later when you get into like the F12 tools, that the F12 tools are really helpful in trying to track down exactly what's applying where, and maybe try to troubleshoot exactly why a particular style isn't applying or not applying. Okay, now the problem with class is the fact that, again, it can be still a little bit too vague. So maybe on a page, there's one little spot that I need to go in and highlight, but only just that one spot. That's it. This is where ID comes into play. ID is only going to work on one specific element, and it's going to be that element with the ID attribute set on it. And that has to be unique. Has to be unique. One little side note here, and I think this is worth mentioning for anybody who's maybe going to be doing manual forms and things like that, is I get a lot of questions about what's the difference between name and ID. And it's a good question. ID is what we can use with JavaScript and with CSS. Name is what's going to be sent back up to the server. Now, if it turns out that you didn't put in a name, then in that case, the ID would be sent up to the server. But if you do have a name, that's what's going to be sent up to the server. So let's say, for example, that again, we've got a form. So I've got my little text box, and on the server, I've got some variable name that I'm going to be expecting. So maybe I'm just expecting that to be, let's say, username.
User.
Yeah. Let's try that again. There we go. USERNAME. I can spell username. See?
Yeah.
Way to go,
good
me.
job.
All right. Yay! Okay. Now, here's the thing: is that's on the server side, and I may not have the ability to go in and change that on the server. So that always has to be username. But I may need to or have a desire to change that on the client side. So that way when I go into my JavaScript and I want to be able to manipulate that and kind of play around with that, I may want to be able to change that and not impact anything on the server. And this is quite common in bigger shops where you've got a web designer and you've got the programmer that's handling the behind the scenes part. So my web designer can sort of do whatever it is that they want, but they're not going to impact the programmer. So they can change the ID, and that's what's going to impact the client. And as long as they keep the name the same, that's still all going to be good. So I always just kind of like to highlight that. Sort of a little bit of a tangent there, but I always like to highlight that because that ID name question always comes up.
Yeah.
So, okay. In any event, the last little thing to mention here is just the syntax. You'll notice pound for an ID. So dot for a class, pound for an ID. Or hash, I guess, for an ID. And I will be the first to admit, I get those backwards quite a bit. I don't know if you do that a lot.
You mean getting the pound sign and the pound sign and the dot?
Exactly. Yeah, that a lot of times I'll say, oh yeah, I want a class, and I'll put a hashtag in front of that.
Yeah, that's usually the first thing I check for when something's not working. I'm just like, I must have selected it wrong.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Okay.